Welcome back to Zach's Comics Conversations, the only place where you can get approximate knowledge of most things in the known universe. Today, I am joined by a very talented creator, a great guy, and someone I am very jealous of. With over 16,000 followers on TikTok, I am joined by a good friend of mine, TravelBeef. Eli, how are you?
I'm doing good today. It's a slow day, it's an off day, so I am fully situated. I got some hot tea and I'm ready to talk about a muck encrusted mockery of a man for as long as you'll let me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Muck Encrusted definitely follows the history of Swamp Thing, not even just the character himself. In real life, he seems to be a very complicated individual.
Yes, there's some tangled threads that we need to unravel here.
100%. So let's start with you. What is your origin story? How did you get into comics? How did you discover the comic book world?
So the first comic books I ever held in my hand were from my half brother's father. He just passed them into the house one day, I guess, and it was an issue of Superboy, and then it was the along with that, I guess this was like a collection that he had from Reign of the Supermen. It was also the introduction of Cyborg Superman. And as a kid, I must have been 5 or 6. I had watched Batman the Animated Series. I was aware of these characters, but that was the first time I was ever fully introduced to the concept that, oh, more goes on with these characters in the pages of these comics than anywhere else. There is consistently just this glut of information on every single character that, in Batman the Animated Series or whatever only had 2 appearances, if that.
Yeah. Or the
from that
Justice
point
League
on,
series. Yeah.
yeah,
100%.
exactly. You see someone in the background and oh my God, this person has 3 volumes of an omnibus.
Yeah. And I think every kid who got into comics, or really just people who even got into them as adults, once you realize that it is the source for everything, that's when it gets really interesting, because you realize, like, I can get it, straight from the direct source of content. And that was always a really, really cool feeling.
You found this wellspring instead of drinking bottled water, essentially.
Yeah, 100%. It's running fresh down the mountain. So what inspired you to make content? You obviously developed a love of comics pretty young. You said 5 or 6. What made you think, I want to make this content as a hobby? I presume was how it started. Maybe it developed. So walk me through that.
So when I first downloaded TikTok, this was at the height of the pandemic, and I had a best friend who was constantly sending me TikTok videos. I didn't have a TikTok account, and he was, every time I would open one, and these were sent, every hour on the hour, because we had nothing better to do. It's the height of quarantine. He would say, please join TikTok, please sign up. Would you like to sign up? And so finally I just kind of threw my hands up in the air and said, sure, why not? I don't know why I saw an old like Samsonite ad at the time. So I wrote, my username was Samsonite Travel Safe. And then it said, you can't use this one's chosen. So I just replaced safe with beef. Over the course of exactly, like, people were like, why do you have that username? People have herald of insert comic name here, but mine was a fluke, and then it stuck, so I don't want to change it now. I started making content. I don't want to say content, it feels too clinical. I just started making videos about comics, whether they be edits or informational or whatever, because I was seeing not so much a rash, but just a plethora of videos and comments from people who said that they wanted to get into comics, but they, for one, found it daunting, and for 2, they found the community extremely hostile.
Yeah.
So just a lot of people who are, I don't want to use the term gatekeeping because it's been used so common, but the gate really has been closed for a lot of people by just, 50-year-old dudes in comic shops screaming at someone they don't know to get out.
Mm-hmm.
And my goal, I guess, I didn't have a goal at the start. It was just making videos, but I wanted to kind of jimmy that gate open as best as I could with the limited resources I have, or just, open a back door if I can and saying, hey, come on, check it out. It's not as scary or daunting as people say. One thing I always try to reiterate in my longer videos is that continuity really doesn't matter.
Yeah, 100%.
As much.
Yeah.
Yeah. You just have to find a character you enjoy and run with it.
Yeah.
And that is my main goal with my account, is to always just keep telling people, hey, here's this cool character. Here's how to maybe get started on them. From there, run wild.
Yeah. 100%. And I think it's being human. I think, like I definitely am. I actually think I'm a very aggressive person in general. I think to a lot of people I come across as laid back, but I am a very aggressive person, and I'm a hater at heart. I really am. And very early on into creating, videos, I like how you said content sounds so clinical. Making videos about comics, I really was the no snark guy, and I was like, we don't need more snark. And I think slowly I just started becoming snarky, and I'm trying to work my way out of that. But I do love that you made, and I think I did have this goal as well, that you wanted to jimmy that gate open. That's a great way to put that. And I've been very staunch in saying, continuity doesn't matter. Pick up where you want to. But I also do believe that comics requires some legwork. You can't just rely on it to be spoon fed to you. Legacy numbers and renumbering, yeah, it's a little unnecessary. I get that. And I can understand how that'd be daunting to people. When I say that comics require some legwork, do you agree with that statement? Do you have caveats to that statement? How does that make you react?
Well, comics, much like any hobby, are going to require an effort from the specific person who's trying to get into them. It's the same as I talked about painting miniatures with you earlier off air, and I talked about all the paint I require, all the different setup, all the different rigs. And there are people who get into painting miniatures and they just don't want to put in that much effort, and they just keep on it at a casual level. So I think there is a way to avoid putting in too much legwork with comics. But I think if you truly want to get into comic reading as a hobby and an interest, there is a modicum of effort that is required. And it's just an equivalent of looking up a couple reading orders. And if a character shows up in a comic you don't know and you want to know more about them, just rush to a wiki.
Yeah.
And
Fandom is
on you,
yeah,
essentially. Yeah.
fandom is a fantastic tool. I talked about that in one of my earlier videos, that fandom is one of those services essentially that just absolutely opens up the floodgates for what you can research and what you can explore. And I think that is, you're 100% right, that looking up a couple reading orders is not much legwork at all. And if you really want to get into collecting and everything, that's where I think it takes some serious legwork. But that's being, like you said, getting fully invested into the hobby. I really love the way you phrased that. I think that what you said about looking up a couple of reading orders and continuity not mattering is kind of akin to my personal philosophy, that with comics, you have to be content not to know everything. Even if you read every single issue that came out from a single publisher, you're still going to be missing, history and lore from 20 years ago. And I think that it's really important for people to understand that, just like any hobby, you're not really going to be an expert unless you spend a lot of money to get to that point. Because even with just comics online, like I'm a pretty staunch advocate of buying and not pirating, and so I take kind of offense when people just post full comics on their TikTok page, and a lot of people are doing that more and more, and it kind of rubs me the wrong way. So if you're going to be like getting into that and following my path, you'd be spending a ton of money reading in the past.
I do believe in what you're saying, where piracy is always the lesser option when it comes to comic books. However, I do want to add a small caveat to that, where if a comic hasn't been reprinted since, 1998 in a single trade, and there's no financially viable way to locate and purchase that trade, then maybe piracy might be the only answer in that case. But then if you find yourself enjoying that story, the next thing to do is to immediately tell people about it and say, we need to get more eyes on this story, not necessarily in a piracy way, but in a way that it can be reprinted due to high demand.
It pressures the publisher into putting out a new collected edition or a new print of that. 100%. I 100% agree with that.
When the ROM omnibus got announced, so many people in my DMs were like, "Did you do this?" And I'm like, "I don't think it was me, but I might add a little."
I don't know. I feel like you had enough eyes watching it that someone somewhere saw it and went, "Yeah, this needs to be done." I 100% think you had an influence on it. I also think that when it comes to bad people and abusers and terrible pieces of garbage,
You
piracy
shouldn't
isn't
purchase their
necessarily the
comics.
worst.
Yeah.
You shouldn't pursue their comics. So if you want to read it, by all means, just go find an option that doesn't support that uh, artist or writer. I think a notable examples like Warren Ellis wrote The Authority, and I didn't know when I bought the trade that he was like a sex pest and a terrible person. So like I decided like, okay, I'm not going to read this anymore. I'm not going to support it. And then you've got like Chuck Dixon, who's like a neo-Nazi now. And you know, he wrote significant amounts of Robin and Nightwing and Batman that are very influential to where the characters are now. Is it morally right to pirate those, you know, those books? I would say because it's Chuck Dixon, absolutely. I would say if it was a person who is hurting for the work, who maybe is an up and coming artist and or writer, and you're pirating their work and posting it for free, that actively takes away from their chances of getting more work because people are watching, you know, your TikTok and scrolling through a slideshow of the whole comic rather than under, you know, going and buying that comic, and now that comic doesn't sell as well, and so they are not viewed as financially viable. I think it's a really delicate ecosystem we have between supporting creators and writers and authors, even if they work for DC or Marvel, as well as supporting, you know, our bottom line, our financial, like we as comic fans are not made of money. And so it is really important to find a financially viable way. I like that you said, you brought that up with something out of print. There may not be a financially viable way to get this thing and engage with this art.
We're here to talk about Swamp Thing today, and we were both talking about comics that are not easily procured in a modern era. Rick Veitch's run that immediately follows up after Alan Moore's run talks about a lot of very important things in the mythos of Swamp Thing. I think it's called Volume 7 Regenerations or New Generations. It is impossible to find that in not a, you know, used, torn up copy or for an absurd amount of money. So even as committed collectors like you and I, there are comics that we just have to bite the bullet and say, well, that's not going to be on my shelf and I have to move on.
Yeah, and if you're collecting physical, that definitely is the case. But what I did find is that on DC Infinite, luckily these services are allowing for not as easily procured physical media. They're able to be digitized and now put on these services, and so you can read them. I'm actually a huge fan of Marvel Unlimited and DC Infinite. I think even though I'm boycotting Marvel right now, I'm really only using DC Infinite. DC Infinite has added so much from Vertigo, and honestly, their pricing is a lot better. And I'm not even a paid spokesman for DC Infinite, but I will advocate for that, especially because it is a relatively affordable way for people to get into comics, and relatively recent comics being, you know, 3 months behind, which is way easier if you're getting into comics than being, you know, infinitely behind because you can't afford them.
Or people who, like me, prefer to collect trades and hardcovers and omnibuses who are going to be 8 months behind at the earliest.
Yeah, and
I mean,
I
yeah.
was a super big proponent for single issues, and I have actually changed my tune after my LCS closed down, couldn't keep their doors open. It was the sign that, like, clean break. I was already cutting back. It's a clean break. Just get out of the single issue game and find other ways to read these comics, which is important. I think that's also part of the legwork. If you want to be a part of a hobby and you can't continue in the same capacity you have been, find a different way, find a different path, because we all love it, and no one path is 100% the right path. You can kind of do what you want, right?
Everyone's going to find comics in their own way.
Yeah, 100%. So going back to kind of your channel, your page really, uh when did you feel like you had some success, or more specifically, do you even feel that you have what you can quantify as success?
I think it was around 5,000 where I started seeing people who were recognizing my name, like, oh, this is another TravelBeef video, where I thought, okay, I might not necessarily have success, but I have entered the minds of a few people at the very least. I have made a small, you know, etching on this giant marble rock of an internet. I don't know. I still wouldn't really quantify myself as successful. I think to be successful in something, you have to, one, be generating at the very least a very small amount of revenue off of it. I don't want to try and monetize anything immediately, but I'm not making a cent off this. In my opinion, I'm still just a fan talking about comics who happens to have a few more people listening to their ramblings than others. When I hit 10,000, I was like, okay, I'm in this. I'm going to keep going with this. I don't think I'm going to stop with this anytime soon. And I'm going to try and aim for something more successful, eventually setting up, whether it be, a YouTube channel or a written work or anything. I'm going to attempt to keep going with this, but right now I would say, I'm just another face in the crowd who happens to be yelling a little bit louder.
That's an awesome way to put it. And I think that's a really good way to, I think, keep yourself humble. I think it's really easy. It's a lot of people, it's human nature to get too big for the britches and get a lot of ego. And I'm kind of that way. When I first started making videos, I was like, I'm just going to do it for me. If someone listens, great. And then I kind of started getting like 250, and now I'm at somewhere around 500. And I started realizing like I'm almost gamifying it. Like I'm too competitive to not want to get more and more. And so I think there's a certain reckoning that we have as creators to figure out what we want to do. I had a conversation with a couple of friends of mine who are also comic talk creators, and one of them brought up that, you have to decide, are you just going to create the content you want at the sacrifice of less views, less likes, less engagement, less followers, or are you going to try to just be what's trendy to gain as much success in the algorithm as possible? And I think you have a very healthy perspective on it, that you're just some guy, another, as you said, face in the crowd, maybe making a small etch on the marble face of the internet. And I think that's a really healthy, well-adjusted way to put it, especially from a creator that I think some would say is one of the biggest on TikTok when it comes to comic talk. Or weirdly enough, I don't feel like comic talk is actually all that big comparatively. I think nerd stuff is a lot bigger. I think that there's obviously accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers that just talk about movies and comic books, but more comic book adjacent things. So I can firmly say though that you have a reputation in specifically people I know, where people know you. In fact, before I started creating videos and even caring about comic talk specifically, I was just a dude on TikTok. I followed you and knew about your videos. And so I think
So
it's,
much. Thanks a lot.
I think it's really cool that I actually get to sit down and talk with you about your success, about who TravelBeef is, Eli. Like that's really cool to me. So you alluded to earlier, said it. It's no surprise. It's in the title. We're talking about Swamp Thing today. And Swamp Thing is admittedly a character I don't know much about. You have told me you know way more about it. You're wearing a Swamp Thing shirt. You care enough about Swamp Thing to have a t-shirt and have a swamp background while we're doing this. So I 100% am deferring to your knowledge for all this stuff. But give me a quick synopsis of who Swamp Thing is, what he's about, and a little bit of his history.
So, Swamp Thing, as he currently sits in the DC universe, is a character who, while still technically part of the main DC universe, essentially sits on the wayside of it and is dealing with more abstract concepts when it comes to. It's much more of a metaphysical comic than a superheroic comic. And it is a man or a plant that convinces itself that it was previously a man who has been transformed, whether it be through science or magic, depending on which iteration of Swamp Thing it is.
We'll get into that because that is a
Yeah.
huge part of who Swamp Thing is, 100%.
Essentially confronting, essentially turning up the stones that other DC heroes might want to leave unturned, whether it be the Winchester house in the middle of nowhere rotting in a forest, or a semi-satanic, cult of witchmen out in the jungle. These are not situations that someone like Batman or Superman are going to be confronting. And that is the main draw to Swamp Thing, at least for me, is that these are stories that have been left untold. These are, frontiers uncharted by any other comic character until this issue in this moment.
Yeah, I can say I did not read nearly as much Swamp Thing as exists to prepare for this. I think that it is a vast, vast history of Swamp Thing, and I think every writer does a different thing. very well too. I think that Swamp Thing is a very consistent book with from what I've read that everything has a certain level of excellence that's put into it. And I think having it be created by Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson is a huge example of that. Those are two giants of the industry, two people that absolutely revolutionized what comics is. And so I think it's really cool that Swamp Thing has those almost historic and heroic beginnings by being created by two legends and it still being a lesser known property. I mean, people don't really know Swamp Thing as much as Batman, Superman, even Green Lantern or Green Arrow. Like those are characters that are very much way more established. So how did you discover Swamp Thing? Was there a specific piece of media, or did you just kind of pick up a random book or a DC encyclopedia and find them? What does your discovery look like?
So, and my discovery of Swamp Thing is, I'm going to try and avoid some heavy topics here. I was not having a fantastic time in high school. We'll put that as softly as we can. I wasn't too keen on sticking around much longer. But luckily, I had a best friend who kept me steady, and he was a massive horror fan and a massive comic book fan. And so he was keeping me keyed into both of those things at a time where I really couldn't care about much of anything. And it had gotten to a point where I would essentially just leave classes, and he would say, "Hey, man, it sucks when you're not here. Just hang around the library and we'll talk at lunch." And I remember there was one day we were hanging out in the library, and he was keeping me steady. And he was like, "Here, just read a comic." And I think he shoved like the first volume of the Len Wein Wrightson era into my hands. And I was just flipping through it kind of absentmindedly. And issue 2 is where the Unmen are leading Swamp Thing to Anton Arcane's castle. And there's this amazing shot with one of the Unmen pointing behind him to the castle. And it's almost biblical. It looks like a Gustave Doré painting or something of Swamp Thing crucified, being led by this sort of gaggle of creatures up to this ancient castle. And I was immediately hooked. I was like, all right, no, rewind, read the first issue fully. We'll work from there. And I don't know what type of funding that library had, because they had all of the original Bronze Age run and then a
Wow.
pretty healthy chunk of the Alan Moore run. I would say up until, the ending of Rite of Spring and the Nuke Face papers.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's yeah. So as someone who also dealt with things like that in high school into college, I definitely can relate to what you're talking about. There's always one character that you find that really speaks to you just a little bit more. And growing up as a person who grew up in a house of faith, I should say, a family of faith. Um, a lot of growing up that way forces you to reckon with yourself a little differently. And so when I discovered Preacher in late high school, early college, it really allowed me to feel like I can question things. I can seek out knowledge and understand and find my place in the world. And it was one of those things that made me feel seen. It made me feel understood. And I can, as a kid in high school who wasn't the most popular or the most charismatic, who, I had friends, but it's still so isolating, especially when it's, the battles and wars you wager in your own mind and against your own self. And having Swamp Thing be a character that you identify with going through that 100% tracks, because Swamp Thing is a character that goes through literal hell and back multiple times, and he just is constantly beaten down and is in essence regeneration incarnate. That it's all about getting beaten down and coming back and being different and better but the same at the same time. And I think that that's a really beautiful analogy that you said about Swamp Thing being crucified and being basically a Renaissance painting, because a lot of it feels biblical in scale.
I will say the one like specific moment where I fully knew I was invested in Swamp Thing, because there was that initial panel that got me hooked. It was just a single dialogue box. And as someone who was, 70 pounds soaking wet in high school, just a tiny little person who was immediately elongating to 6'6" and undergoing this painful transformation for my body, also dealing with some painful transformations in my mind and realizing that maybe the world's not going to pull any punches with me, seeing a character who, at the end of the first arc of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, says outright, I want to live and I want to continue growing, was extremely important to me at that moment, because it was one of the few things that was keeping me going to classes at that time, essentially saying, whether things are bad or good, you have to sustain yourself to at least find out whether they're going to be a negative or a positive outcome.
So reading through Saga of the Swamp Thing from issue 1 with Greg Pascoe writing before Alan Moore even gets on the book, he only comes in at issue 20. I see a lot of similarities to Man-Thing as a character and as a concept, as well as the Incredible Hulk. This transformation, this loneliness, this isolation, and this wandering feeling. How can you describe that hybrid? Did that stick out to you? Is that something that you think is inherent to the character?
At least pre-Moore, I do enjoy your kind of allusions to the Hulk, because in a sense, he is kind of a riff on that character. It's clear that there was some inspiration there, and that's kind of become an archetype in comic books, the lone, freak of nature wanderer, whatever you want to refer to it as, and both of them being scientists, of course. But at least pre-Moore, I always saw Swamp Thing as sort of the EC Comics, not DC Comics, but like EC Comics, creep show kind of thing, answer to Conan the Barbarian almost, where he is a wanderer, obviously, who goes from location to location, fighting essentially a wizard. Anton Arcane in the earliest issues is a wizard who later on becomes an ogre almost. And with Wrightson's artwork at the time that is so sinewy and muscular, it almost takes like a pop art approach to a Frank Frazetta painting. So while yes, there are elements of the Incredible Hulk there, of Man-Thing there, you can even go back even further to the Heap or someone like Ben Grimm, of just this person who was unjustly transformed and now is left to wander the earth. I always saw it more of a fantastical comic that happened to have a sci-fi beginning.
I actually have always said that Marvel is science comics with magic mixed in, and DC is magic with science mixed in. And so I think that it's really interesting that you bring that up, because my next kind of point to make was the Comics Code Authority really stepped in and kind of changed a lot about this book in terms of its intention. It was always under the Comics Code Authority when it started, but there is this sense of scientific to start that is also magical and spiritual. Specifically I'm going to speak in terms of Saga of the Swamp Thing. That was the thing I read the most. You see that, it's this transformation from an explosion, but then as you get further into more and even post more, it's very magical. It's very mystical. And then even now he's the avatar of the green. And so he's this very magical being and has access to magic, and all of his enemies aren't environmental or scientific. They're not industrialists. They're magicians. And I think that that's a really interesting way to evolve the character. Do you think that that was a necessary change? Do you think that maybe they hit a wall and had to change, or do you think that they just pivoted because it was more interesting?
That is a really fantastic question, actually. I can easily see a writer struggling with still, 20 issues in, writing a character who is at that point essentially a guy covered in mud, and having to carry it into a more spiritual and mystical and magical realm, so you can do more, you can expand his power set. He's no longer just a strong guy who happens to be green and has, minor plant powers. Then it can be something fully, not just magical, but in Moore's case and Rick Veitch's case, psychedelical. It is explicitly like a new age superhero. And I think that the reason that is stuck so much, even when they bring back Alec Holland and New 52 stuff, is because, yeah, you hit a wall essentially, with writing that character for more than 20 issues. And it's just remaining, oh, I used to be human, and I'm not too big on being green now.
Yeah, that seems like a dead end. And I think also you can only one of the reasons Captain Planet didn't go on too long or is environmental storylines you can only tell so much. And that's then you have to branch out and you have to find something different. And I think Alan Moore, as much as I'm not necessarily his biggest fan, I think he's slightly overrated. I think he's a little pretentious. He is really good at creating a wider and vaster scale and world and giving characters depth in that regard. So I think he was probably the perfect person to do that, especially at that time when he's kind of at his height.
He's still holding in a bit of the
Yeah,
more eccentric ideals.
yeah, he's not as esoteric as he was.
System.
Yeah, 100%. But what's really cool is that so the Comics Code Authority was Swamp Thing was always under its its reign. The CCA started in the 58, I believe. But then they finally kind of just said, I don't really care. We're going to publish anyway with Alan Moore's issue 29. Are you immediately readily available to tell me what issue 29 is about and give a general synopsis?
So issue 29, and if people listening don't know about the Comics Code Authority, it was essentially in the wake of several pop psychologists claiming that comics were damaging to children. And this was at the time where comics were almost exclusively marketed towards children. So they were given all of these different parameters that they could not act outside of. And one of the main ones was no ghouls, and you couldn't have the villain win. And so when Alan Moore brought the script for issue 29 to editor Karen Berger, which has an army of zombies, Antar Arcane rising back up out of hell and possessing Abby Arcane's husband in an implicitly like lecherous moment. And then at the end of the comic, succeeding and sending Abby to hell, Karen Berger essentially said, yeah, we're off the map here and there's no way we can edit this. So I guess this is the end of the CCA for us. And it was the first DC comic that was published entirely without the Comics Code Authority's permission and stamp of approval. And after that, I think DC kind of realized that their hand was a little bit off the steering wheel. And so they just hit the gas and went all in on dark and disturbing for quite a while.
100%. And I think that little tease for, I guess, my audience, all few of you. I'm working on a YouTube video and a TikTok series about The Question, specifically the 86 Denny O'Neil series. And
which is the best.
Yeah, it's the definitive series. And one of the things that I kind of noticed is that it is the precursor to Vertigo. Like, it is one of the first mature books that says for mature readers on it. And this is 86 through 88, 89. And so they are saying, hey, we're going to need to make a new imprint. And that was when Vertigo and Wildstorm eventually started. And I think even then, Swamp Thing under Alan Moore specifically is even the precursor to the precursor. This was one of the first things where they were like, no, we're going to start making like mature books and things that aren't just for kids. And they really kind of broke out of that mold. I recorded a video recently, a little fun facts video, which will be posted long before this is up. In 1971, Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams, basically in rebellion to the CCA, who had a rule that like drugs can't be used, but then they changed it to like, oh, well, drugs can't be praised. Like, it has to be shown that it's evil.
There must be a negative connotation.
Yeah, they 100% jumped to the worst conclusion, like the worst result, and they gave Speedy a heroin addiction. And that was the start of Roy Harper's like drug addiction all the way back in 1971, just as a way to be like, who cares? And that was, it's really interesting you brought up like issue 29 of Saga the Swamp Thing is the first DC to be published without the CCA. That was the one that used the CCA against itself. And that's really one of the only records that is before Saga the Swamp Thing. I think a lot of what DC did is like, oh, we're going to play by the rules. That was kind of pushing the boundary. But once you get to, the mid 80s, that was when there was a real shift in everything and even media. And I think that when comics started getting marketed towards teenagers, we saw that the Satanic Panic started, started up in the
Satanic
80s.
Panic is all over this run.
Oh
I mean, you
man,
can't
absolutely.
imagine.
And I think that this got marketed towards the teens who wanted to rebel, and that's ultimately what led to its success. So Alan Moore started on issue 20. Issue 29 was the CCA issue, and then he lasted until issue number 64. So he did 45 issues of Swamp Thing. Can you outline what pre-Moore, Moore's Run, and post-Moore looks like for Swamp Thing in a digestible fashion? Obviously, there's a lot of facets to that.
There's a lot to get into, but I'll try and keep it brief. Pre-Moore was essentially, like you said, a science fiction horror comic about a wandering loner fighting monsters. And he did pick up, some supporting cast along the way. Abigail Arcane and is the main one. It's the main, I would almost argue, near the end of, the Bronze Age, she's almost a co-lead. But the moment that Moore stepped in, and I don't know if I fully agree with what he did on issue 20, he essentially burns that down. There's several supporting characters who are either killed, chased out of the story, or just forgotten about entirely. And then by issue 21, he is entirely. Issue 21 is called the Anatomy Lesson for a good reason, because it systematically, panel by panel, explains the new status quo for this character. And throughout Moore's run, it definitely hinges on the fact that this is not the character that you previously thought. And it is it's almost like the longest origin story you've ever heard of for a character who already had two origin stories.
100%. Yeah. And it's very interesting that Alan Moore does that a lot. He is just going to do what he wants to do, but only Alan Moore can do what he wants to do. And it works for the most part. I don't feel like many comic creators in general have gotten the free reign that he had. Maybe like Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko at one point.
Maybe Morrison. Maybe
yeah,
if they're lucky. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that Alan Moore can get away with what he gets away with. And so what did the new status quo look like? Can you explain kind of how it progresses from issue 20 to 65? Or 64
Absolutely.
rather? Where's the start point? Where's the end point? What happens in the middle?
So the start point is a scientist by the name of Jason Woodrue finds out that Swamp Thing does not have a human body underneath, the thick layer of, plant matter, essentially. There's no meat. It's just all plant. The lungs are useless. The brain is useless, which immediately establishes that this character is not of science. This is a magical character. And once you move past his early sort of identity crisis about not being a person and always having been a plant, and John Constantine enters the picture, the rest of that run is almost a test drive of all of his new powers, peaking in the arc where Abby is on trial in Gotham City, and he's pulling every trick out of the book that he's learned over the last previous issues to essentially become, if not a godlike figure, then someone with an extreme level of power, almost beyond any other character in the DC universe. And so writers from that point on had a bit of a challenge on their hands to keep to maintain a consistent struggle in the story, essentially. Because once you're completely done with Moore's run, there's nothing Swamp Thing can't do. I mean, he's regenerated onto other planets. He has solved several different famines. He is transformed into a kaiju made of redwood trees. It is this, it's a test drive, essentially. Now that he has come to terms with being this plant god, this green man, mythical figure, it's just sort of, let's see what this can do. Let's get out there and test all of this. Yeah. And so I think new writers after that really had to struggle to keep not just a struggle, but a humanity to the book.
Yeah.
Because once you have a character that is implicitly not human, you really have to maintain sympathy and empathy throughout the entire run.
Yeah, and I think what I noticed throughout reading all of the Swamp Thing I did, and even some of the newer stuff, like I read Swamp Thing Green Hell. I did a video about the winter special from 2018, which was really released in 2017. Spoiler alert. But those things had to maintain heart. Like that is one of the things that Swamp Thing has been really consistent with is that there is heart to it. And I think if they didn't keep that heart, they would have lost it. I don't think Swamp Thing would be around today if they hadn't kept that together and kept that as part of who Swamp Thing is.
It's the one reason why I think Swamp Thing maintained not, a huge foothold, but a foothold in the cultural zeitgeist of comic books is because you can directly compare it to Alan Moore's run on Marvel Man or Miracle Man or whatever you want to call that book with the whole legal entanglement there. But by the end of his run on Miracle Man, there is no heart. Your character has reached a similar level of omniscience, but his supporting cast is essentially dissolved away, and you're just left with a boring, omniscient lead. So I think by more wisely at the end of his run, keeping a lot of pieces on the chessboard, whether it be Chester or Abigail or Elizabeth or any of those characters, he really teed up the shot for following writers to keep that heart steady.
So, what do you wish people knew about Swamp Thing as a character? You obviously have a very lengthy history with Swamp Thing. What do you feel like you need to scream out to people because he's so misunderstood in this one area?
One thing that I have to reiterate constantly that people need to know about Swamp Thing is that it's fun, even when it's a dire, horrific book with a lot of horrible things going on in it. The art and the writing and the dry sarcasm it maintains still keeps it a fun, light read, even when things seem their darkest. Because I've seen a lot of people say, I don't want to get into Swamp Thing. It looks like it's just suffering constantly. No, there's a lot of humor and heart and love to be found, especially once Abigail officially declares her love for Swamp Thing and he reciprocates it.
What I noticed too, absolutely, is that when Saga of the Swamp Thing starts with Greg Pasco's run, there's a ton of monologue of him just absolutely stream of conscious, like just beating on people. And he's like, what, you want this? You want this? Didn't I show you last time? Oh, fire a gun at me. It doesn't work. And I think that that is so integral to the sarcasm and sense of humor that this book has throughout its run. And it just goes from the start. Obviously, Swamp Thing was around before Saga of the Swamp Thing. That's not the first series, but it is the most notable in my opinion. I think that that's the one everybody knows. And Alan Moore's run is, legendary. There's a reason it's collected and constantly in print. Everybody wants it. Do you think that that sarcasm can be misplaced at times? I think that a lot of books will try to put too much humor. Garth Ennis is really bad about that in Preacher and even Punisher Max. Do you think Alan Moore falls into that trap at times?
I think Alan Moore is an extremely nihilistic person, and you can see that a lot in his writing. I think for the most part, it's a healthy balance. Like, Abby will be on trial for crimes against nature, and when she's, in the drunk tank, she says she's in there for tree hugging. Like there's a consistent humor throughout, and it's
That's so
never
stupid. Yeah, that's such a
yeah.
that's such a like, pardon the pun, low hanging fruit.
Oh, absolutely, or low hanging yam in this
Yeah.
context, I guess. But I only think the dry nihilistic sarcasm kind of goes off the rails in one issue, and I'm sorry I don't have the issue number written down. This is like the one issue I have to warn people about when they're reading this, and it is the Roots parody, I would guess you could call it.
Yeah.
There is a yeah, and I feel like I have to get this on record. There is an issue where a television show, soap opera, whatever it may be, is being filmed in Swamp Thing's area, and it is explicitly a drama about slavery. And there's a lot of questionable lines in that where you're like, is this meant to be a joke? Or is Alan Moore just not as, he doesn't have his finger on the heartbeat of American politics as much as he does British politics? There's some questionable lines in that, where Abby's like, "Oh, I can't imagine anyone being sad in this area," and it's like, this is the South, and there's a plantation right behind us.
Dude, 100%. It's there are parts that are very tone deaf, and what I found in the question, which is written, there's a little bit. I don't know if there's a ton of overlap. I don't even know if there's any, but it's very close to Moore's run of Saga of the Swamp Thing, as well as Denny O'Neil picking up on the question. There are some moments that are really tone deaf given where we are now. So in 2024, it's not okay. 86, it was like
Questionable.
slightly more okay. Like it wasn't bad then, but now
It wasn't bad. It was raise your eyebrow.
yeah, it was okay. Especially by the youth, the more like
Yeah.
finger on the pulse of politics. Absolutely.
Yeah. I've seen people try to recontextualize that issue as sort of exploitation movies were popular, and it's riffing on the concept of people dragging up this horrible, horrible history for profit. But that issue itself is also dragging up the horrible history for profit. So it kind of falls on deaf ears in that case.
And one of the things that made exploitation films, specifically black exploitation films, so meaningful in art as well as profitability is that they were created by the people who had suffered and the
Yeah.
demographic who had suffered. So they know the struggles. It's not like they're just some, they're not a white
Pasty
man
white
writing a
British
comic,
wizard from the UK.
yeah, who also has questionable politics in 2024.
Yeah.
It's not like the
Yeah.
dude's some like absolutely based person. Like he's got some
No.
terrible opinions about things. Like he's
Yeah.
super nihilistic. So like he doesn't care about anything. So we've obviously talked about Alan Moore. We've mentioned names like Greg Pascoe and correct me if I'm wrong, David Veitch.
Rick Veitch.
Rick Veitch.
Yeah.
So who are more notable runs, artists, writers that are on this book that maybe people don't know about, or they didn't realize did write this thing? For example, the new Penguin or the current Penguin series is written by Tom King. A lot of people don't know that.
Yeah.
Is there a certain instance that you can think of where someone is actually writing this and you don't really realize it's them, and they maybe become more popular later on, or they were at the height and you just didn't realize?
I do think the main person with that is the New 52 run with Scott Snyder, because when it comes to New 52 and Scott Snyder, your brain almost auto completes that sentence to Batman. So having him also be simultaneously working on Swamp Thing, I feel like it almost slid under the radar as that really good New 52 run written by Scott Snyder, especially when it redefines the whole mythology of Swamp Thing to such a massive extent that I think people were far too. I love the New 52 Batman run, but it's not the only thing Scott Snyder's ever written.
100%. And people tend to look at creators in a microcosm. A lot of people do that with Tom King and Mr. Miracle. They tend to only look at what he did there, or they tend to only look at his Supergirl or his Batman run, which a lot of people hate. I'm indifferent on. I think it's pretty good, actually.
I've come around to it. When it first hit, I was like, this is strange, but
I don't know. The Gotham storyline at the beginning, Gotham and Gotham Girl, was a really great storyline, so I will stand by that.
My main issue is I don't think Mikhail Janin, and I hope I pronounced that right, was the right artist for a Batman story. You see his initial pencils and they look great, but once you get fully into the digital softening and digital coloring of all of it, it looks like a Telltale game without the lighting engine.
I agree, especially the cover of like issue 18 or something like that. It's one of the ones right before Bane becomes the main antagonist of the run, and it very much looks like you're 100% right, a Telltale game without the lighting engine.
Speaking of artists and people who were on the top of their game, Saga of the Swamp Thing, John Toddleben. Oh my God. I have seen some people complain that he has, same face syndrome, or however you want to phrase that when it comes to
Steve Dillon
characters.
has that real bad, and Frank Whiteley, both of them.
Mark Bagley.
Yep, 100%.
The reason people see a lot of John Toddleben's characters having the same face is that they are all explicitly not young people. Like, I don't think there's a person in that run that's, under the age of 30. And they all look extremely vulnerable. They all look like they're ready to just fall over any minute. And so I think a lot of people just saw that and immediately thought, he's not a good artist. But when you look at the intricate detail of Swamp Thing's body, in any panel, you immediately realize that, oh my God, this guy needed to get more work.
That was one of the things I really enjoyed about the run is that as you progress, Swamp Thing actually looks better and better. He doesn't
Yeah.
stay just a green mass. Like he actually has vines and moss and, tendrils. And I think that that is really cool. I also think, and, chime in on this. Maybe I'm misguided. Do you think that maybe one of the reasons why, you could maybe explain that he had same face syndrome is that to now Swamp Thing, everybody looks the same because he's no longer human and he's forgetting what it's
That
like
could
to
be,
be human.
yeah.
I mean, I think
It's
that's
a possible.
apology. I
Yeah.
think that's being an apologist for for the same face syndrome. But I think that that's a pretty decent explanation. I don't think
No,
anyone,
yeah.
if you postured that to
And
somebody or he said that in an interview, people would be
I
like,
can
"Oh,
see
he's
him
an
trying to
idiot."
spin that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, 100%. Save some face. Pardon the pun.
Yeah. It's like that guy who was just in court for Peaky Blinders. He was arrested for drug
Yeah.
possession, and his lawyer was like, "He's staying in character.
Yeah. As
Like
of
you could spin
yeah,
anything."
as of recording, that happened yesterday.
Yeah,
So,
which is insane. I woke up to that news this morning. I was like, "What?
he just has
That's
dedication to the fans. That's all it
there you
is. That's
go."
why he's
Yeah,
drunk and high all the time. To cap off Swamp Thing, what are notable runs, artists, and writers that you would suggest someone go read?
absolutely.
Not necessarily ones that you didn't know were on it or wouldn't recognize are on it. What are the best runs, maybe for a beginner, intermediate, and expert, someone who for each level who wants to get into Swamp Thing?
I think, funnily enough, I know everyone's going to say, "Oh, immediately start Saga of the Swamp Thing with Alan Moore." I think the easiest way to get into Swamp Thing is the Bronze Age because it is when it is at its most simple, introduces the most characters that are going to remain mainstays, and it introduces the very basic concept of Swamp Thing. And everything else has kind of, for lack of a better word, grown off of that. I know some people are going to recommend New 52 first, but New 52,
Yike.
yeah,
Yeah.
explicit. It's like the only New 52 book that explicitly is like everything before this still happened. We're just gonna try and fit this square peg into this round hole. You're like, no, no, this is meant to be a reboot. Which I do like that. That's one thing to recommend Swamp Thing to people is that, with so many Batman reboots or so many Superman reboots, oh, you should read John Byrne Man of Steel. Don't read John Byrne Man of Steel. It has been one consistent story throughout the entire run, even when he's been rebooted, they make that reboot a central part of the next story. And I would recommend first the Bronze Age, and obviously go with Alan Moore. Um, I'm gonna make a controversial call. I don't like Rick Veitch's run that much.
I don't blame you. Yeah, from what I read, it wasn't awesome.
I will say it had some really interesting ideas. For one, the birth of their daughter Tefe, and the whole moral quandary that felt very prescient at the time of the 90s, where it's like, we need to get a surrogate father. Like, that's a very culturally relevant topic, especially for the early 90s. But I think he mostly, from working with Alan Moore, just decided, oh, I'll just keep doing what Alan did. But no one knows what Alan's doing except Alan.
And he does it worse. Like he's not
Yeah,
Alan Moore, so it doesn't stick the landing.
I think the wheels fall off with that run, specifically in issue 88. Which, have you heard about the infamous canceled issue 88 of Swamp Thing?
I have not. Why don't you enlighten us on it?
This was entirely completed. I don't know if it was colored or inked, but I know the pencil sketches were complete, and it had managed to find its way into some solicitation ads. Issue 88 was, can't remember what the title of it was, but it has something to do with a magician. It was going to be Swamp Thing meets Jesus. He was
That's
going to
insane.
travel. Yeah, he was going to travel back in time to the moment of the crucifixion and have a sort of back and forth with Jesus Christ, whether you believe in that or don't. I think we can all agree that that is not the best move for a DC comic to confirm that.
One that was
I mean,
already
DC,
pissing off Christians. Yeah, it's
yeah,
probably not a safe bet.
yeah, and that is, they made the executive decision at the last minute to say we can't do this at all. You can look up the canceled cover, and it's Swamp Thing's decapitated head on a cross. I can't imagine the storm that would have got brewing.
That's
If
so
that had reached the
badass, though.
shelves. Yeah,
That is
yeah,
so badass.
it's a really great. It's really. I mean, it's Rick Veitch doing the art, so it's still really good. I mean, he's up front, he's crucified, and in the very back, there's a spotlight on the other three crosses. The soldier, Jesus, and the thief. I think you could do something interesting with that story because, like we were talking earlier, Swamp Thing is explicitly a messianic figure. He has been crucified multiple times. He dies and comes back to life. there are elements to that, but it's subtext. It should not become overt text where he looks at Jesus and goes, "Wow, you're just like me." That's
100%.
yeah.
100%.
Yeah. The next thing I would recommend is Nancy Collins' run, which was just reprinted in Omnibus fairly recently after years of not being printed. As much as I, poo-poo on the Rick Veitch run, that needs that treatment as well, because right now it's basically impossible to find. It's fun. It's not as dire as Alan Moore's run, but it keeps that sort of consistent, people call it, American Gothic
Mm-hmm.
ideal, where it's, specifically American myths being presented. Like, I think there's an issue where they meet Santa Claus, which is like the much softer version
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
issue 88. Yeah. And he's speaking Creole French and he's wearing sunglasses. It's very fun. It's very light. It's very early 2000s comic book where all the characters are a lot more rounded and bright. And
Yeah.
while there's concepts that are strange, it's more fun as opposed
It's more
to
playful. Yeah, it's absolutely more playful.
Yeah, Nancy Collins was having fun with the concept. New 52, you obviously have to read eventually because it's the status quo for the character going forward. And they did a similar thing that Alan Moore did where, they burnt down the previous thing where it's like, oh yeah, that Swamp Thing happened, but now Alec's back. And he's always meant to be the real Swamp Thing, which was controversial at the time, but I think they made it work. I think it recontextualizes the character of Anton Arcane into a much more genuine threat. Because by the end of the Nancy Collins run, he's like a joke. He's been thrown into hell several different times. They play football with his head as part of his penance in hell. So recontextualizing him as this, the same way that the Swamp Thing is the avatar of green, he's the avatar of the black, the rot, all of the desiccation and filth in the world, I think makes that character into something that is not just a lecherous, creepy uncle who happens to have the body of a cave troll, and instead turns him into the bona fide, standard, best villain of Swamp Thing, and one of the best Vertigo villains, because Vertigo as an imprint really didn't, have a lot of villains, over long periods of time. Desire was more of just an antagonist in Sandman. But when you're talking about villains, thanks to New 52, Anton Arcane he's up there with Joker for me in terms of just like, oh, you're just the worst.
So now we're going to move into some rapid fire questions. I'm going to ask you this or that, essentially, and then we're going to end with your favorite storyline of all time, your favorite artist, your favorite writer, your favorite duo. First off, DC, Indie, or Marvel?
Oh, God. These are some rapid fire questions. In light of certain things in this current moment in the world at this current point in time, I am going to say DC. In terms of just the quality of stories, my one main issue with DC right now is their continuity has gotten murky. But like we said at the beginning of this, continuity does not matter, so that's not a big, point deducted for me. I would say that DC. Yeah, there's a stigma around DC nowadays because most of the movies aren't that great.
100%. I'm really hoping. I'm really pulling for James Gunn. Really pulling for him.
Oh my God, we didn't even get into all the terrible Swamp Thing adaptations there are.
Maybe we'll do a part two. Maybe we'll do a part two.
We can do a part
we'll
two.
Focus on specific runs. Awesome.
Yeah, but for now, DC.
Perfect. Invincible or The Boys?
Are we talking about the comics or the show?
You choose.
If we're going comics, Invincible absolutely, obviously wins hands down because the Boys comic, even fans of the Boys,
it's so bad. Yeah, it's so bad.
It's just mean-spirited and ugly and hateful throughout the entirety of its run. So if we're going by comics, Invincible. If we're going by the shows, I'd say they're fairly tied, honestly.
I would 100% agree. I actually am like not that high on The Boys in general. I can understand its merit, but Invincible all the way. So despite take the Swamp Thing bias out of it, Alan Moore or Grant Morrison?
Grant, hands down, instantly.
Legend. Absolutely. The much better wizard.
I don't enjoy a lot of Alan Moore stuff that isn't Swamp Thing. I enjoy From Hell. I'm God's one and only Miracle Man defender. But apart from that, I'm not gonna defend, what was it, Necronomicon or
I honestly
Extraordinary Gentlemen is terrible.
Watchmen. I'm down on Watchmen even. Like I
think Watchmen has merit. I just think it it happened at a time, the same way The Dark Knight Returns has merit. It happened at a time where people had seen nothing like it. And so they're equating their memories with it, with the actual
Yeah.
objective value of it.
Well, it's
Yeah.
like when people, I'm also not a big fan of Batman Hush, but because it happened and was
Oh,
kind
Hush
of
is terrible.
iconic.
Hush
Yeah.
is the worst Batman mystery. Who's
Yeah.
it going to be? It's this guy who just showed up.
Vertigo or Black Label?
See, I have issues with Black Label. I find it strange that they're reprinting older stories that were considered canon now in Black Label, and that is something that Vertigo never did. So Vertigo was its own separate thing, and then DC essentially tore it down and then replaced it with a worse version.
I don't know. I kind of
I
like DC Black Label, but I
I
agree
enjoy Black
Vertigo.
Label.
Yeah,
It's
I
better.
agree.
Yeah.
Vertigo's
Just
better.
for one, it was explicitly canon, and two, there's not as much edgy stuff in Vertigo.
Yeah.
You're not getting Batman Reptilian in Vertigo.
I don't know,
Vertigo
man.
all the way.
100 bullets and
Ugh.
yeah, all that kind of stuff.
Invisibles.
Yeah, right. Collected editions or single issues?
Collected editions, absolutely. I
You
think
kind of answered that earlier, so I had an inkling of what you were going to say.
I do collect both, and I think with certain comics, detached from our current time period, I think it's an interesting time capsule to flip through those, especially when it comes to the advertisements. Like I have some issues of the Nate Gray X-Men run post Age of Apocalypse that have ads for Halloween 6 before they landed on a title. Yeah. It was the origin of Michael Myers instead of the curse, because that movie was in production hell. And so just
Yeah.
having that on a shelf, it's like, oh, this is a piece of history.
I have I've been on record on my page and I collected Punisher Euro Hit, which is totally not notable Punisher run from the 90s that it was just one of the first comic books I picked up. I picked up like 8 of 12 or something like that. There are ads for Charleston Chew in it. I mean, it's like totally a time capsule. I 100% agree that it is really cool to flip through those, but I will say bottom dollar collected editions really outweigh.
Just for one, they're usually collected to be a cohesive story.
100%.
And two, there's less stuff you have to store. You don't have to buy a giant long box for single issues. You can or like trades, you can just put those on a shelf.
Earth Prime or Elseworlds?
I think Elseworlds has the issue of you're never allowed to sit long enough in that world to really absorb it. Earth Prime has its issues. There are whole, eras of DC Comics that I'm not a huge fan of, but it's the difference between a friend you've just met who seems really, really cool and a family member who has a lot of eccentricities and dark moments, but you still love them dearly.
That's a great way to put that. Is a
reason,
fantastic way to put it.
I've been around Earth Prime longer. I understand what makes it tick, so Earth Prime.
100%. All right. Favorite storyline out of any comic?
I've gone on record saying my favorite cohesive run of a comic book is
We can call it a run. Yeah, we can call it a run.
Yeah. My favorite cohesive run of a comic book is Immortal Hulk. Some points were docked because of the artist, Joe Bennett, but then Al Ewing went on record saying he's not getting a cent from this. And immediately, I mean, regardless of the morality of that, we're talking about, donating your money to terrible people. I'm glad Joe Bennett is making no money off of that, so I can safely call it, again, my favorite comic run.
Yeah, I loved Immortal Hulk. I think that's definitely up there for me. I think
I would call it the modern Saga of the Swamp Thing, where you have
essentially
a character who is previously established becoming wildly different because of some British guy named Al.
Yeah, and gaining so much more depth as a character.
And heart.
Yeah, 100%. Favorite artist of all time?
I really like Greg Capullo, or Capullo, however you pronounce that name. I heard someone pronounce it Capullo, so I don't know. I'll have to look into that. But I really enjoy his extremely blocky, but it's not blocky to the extent of Rob Liefeld. They still look like human beings.
Yeah.
So if not my favorite artist, I would say he's absolutely my favorite Batman artist. But in recent years, Mitch Gerads has run up to the plate and knocked it out of the park. So I would say it's tied between those two right now. That Mr. Miracle run is something else.
I can totally understand that. I think I'll go on record and say mine's probably Marco Cicchetto.
You can't go wrong, man.
Yeah,
You're living right now.
His work on Daredevil was fantastic.
It's so textured. You can almost feel everything on the page.
It is absolutely amazing. Favorite writer of all time?
Well, non-comic, I'm going to say Harlan Ellison, even though he did write a few comics. For comics, I wouldn't say I have one right now because if I go out and say Grant Morrison, someone's going to bring up all the terrible things that Grant Morrison has written. If I
Well,
bring up,
favorite doesn't mean best. The favorite
yeah,
doesn't mean best at all.
I would say in terms of like I can recommend any story by this person and someone reading that comic will be bound to have a good time. Al Ewing is the current. I mean, he's cruising. He's doing fantastically.
I would
Hickman's up there
counter,
too.
yeah, I'd counter with Jed McKay or Chip Zdarsky.
Oh my god, yeah.
I
Chip
feel like
is
both those guys have way more hits than misses, and you pretty much can't go wrong. People don't love Chip Zdarsky's Batman. I can see the merit to that, but I also think it's fun enough that anybody who's
it's
reading
extremely
will enjoy it.
fun with the
Yeah,
universe hopping, but I also think he's doing an important thing where he's addressing instead of avoiding them, because a lot of runs will avoid the less savory aspects of Batman. He's addressing them, and he is not, if not eliminating them, he's putting them away for writers that want to use them and keeping them out of the way of writers who don't want to use them. With the whole Zurin R, Zurin R essentially reads how fanfic writers write Batman.
yeah, 100%, 100%.
So he's fantastic.
Favorite duo, meaning artist writer or blue and gold like Booster Gold and Blue Beetle. Either way,
I think it might be Blue. I think it might be Booster Gold and Ted because they're
yeah,
just they remind me so much of me and my best friend.
not the Green Bros.
Not the Greens. And I know everyone says, oh, Daredevil and Spider-Man. That is like Midnight Suns in the case of, yeah, that happens occasionally in comics, but the outer world outside of comics has essentially, swelled that to something that it is not.
Yeah, like they don't love each other.
No,
Like
especially
Johnny and Peter is a much better,
yeah.
a
Yeah, I
much
would
better
put them
duo.
up there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I would
And Reed and
say
Sue are up there as well.
my favorite duo. Yeah, and I think I'm biased because Preacher is one of my favorite comics of all time. Is Jesse Custer and Cassidy. I think that's a fantastic duo. I think they're really fun. I think they play off each other really well. Perfect. So thank you so much for joining me. We are out of time. Plug
It was great
yourself.
being here.
Where can people find you? What are you up to? Tease something if you're working on a project. The floor is yours.
Yes. I currently don't have any huge videos planned. I know I tend to put out videos the moment that the idea kind of hits in my head. I try and rush them out, which probably detracts from their quality, but I don't have anything huge in the chamber right now. I would say just follow me on TravelBeef at TikTok and anticipate that once I have a proper recording space and the budget to do it, I will probably make a pretty significant shift over to YouTube where I will be allowed to ramble for as long as I've rambled in this video, in this podcast. Yeah, follow me. Make sure to, if you enjoy the stuff, if you have any complaints about it, please make that known. Like, I tend to feel like I'm in sort of an echo chamber right now. So please, if you have any issues with my content, make it known, comment it, DM it to me.
There are very few people who ask for the haters to come after them.
I'm not talking about hate necessarily, because I get plenty of that, trust me. But I would say, yeah, if you have anything that you think could improve comic video that I'm making, let it be known. I've had people for a while, and I tried to avoid this because I didn't want to become, the DJ request guy. But there were people who were like, "Hey, can you do a video on this, even if it's a short little edit?" I'm like, "Okay, I've never heard of that, but I'll look into it, make sure that it's not horribly offensive or anything." Yeah, sure, I'll put out a video on that.
That people are like, make a Pat Labor like
Propaganda Gundam, absolutely,
yeah.
sure.
Well, thank you, Eli, for coming on. I appreciate it. I wish
great
you
being-
all the best. You are a very talented creator, good friend, and
Thank
I
you.
think
Thank
you.
you. I'm trying to get better. That's the one thing I would say to
Hey,
look out for is a marked improvement in quality.
That is all we can do. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you very much to Eli, aka Travel Beef. That was a fantastic conversation, and he is a fantastic creator. He is insightful and makes some awesome edits. So if you haven't, go follow him on his TikTok page at TravelBeef. I will link it down below. And as always, if you don't follow me on TikTok, you can follow me at Zach's Comics Box. I'll put it right here. Make sure to like and subscribe and share my videos. Thanks for dropping in. I'll see you next time.